A shadow walks where no one should. Welcome to Veil Files. I am your host, Thorn. Tell me where you're tuning in from. Your voices matter here. Let's dive in. The pea-soup fog of a late November evening had pressed itself against the windows of Baker Street, blurring the passing lamps into pale coins and muffling the hoofbeats below. Dr. Watson sat with his hands to the fire, watching the thin blue ribbon of smoke from Holmes's cigarette rise and break against the brass fender. Holmes reclined upon the sofa with that air of languid indifference which, as Watson well knew, masked the restless activity of his mind. His violin lay idle across his knees, the bow, still strung with a single long hair caught upon the bridge, seemed to wait upon a theme he would not give. "There is damp in that left boot, Watson," said Holmes, without turning his head. "Not from the street. The color is darker at the instep than at the toe, which shows it was taken in from a mat after the water had already wicked up from within. You have been somewhere with oilcloth at the threshold, and a servant careless with his pail. The surgery, then. Your morning list was long enough to make you late here." Watson could not but smile. "Mrs. Treginnis's boy," he confessed. "The hall was newly washed. But how on earth? The oil that is used for such floors leaves a scent like turnip peelings." "It clings to the leather," Holmes returned, as though the matter were beneath the dignity of comment. He lifted his eyes toward the ceiling. "There are days when London refuses to supply any but domestic mysteries. I am starved, Watson." The bell pealed below with a decisiveness that belongs to men who expect doors to open. A murmur in Mrs. Hudson's voice, a heavier tread upon the stairs. Holmes had already set the violin aside and was upright, the lean face sharpening as a fencer's does when he sees at last a worthy blade. Inspector Lestrade entered first, his hat brim stippled with fog, and behind him a gentleman of middle height and admirable tailoring, whose carefully schooled composure did not survive the sight of Holmes's piercing gaze. He clutched a folded paper in a glove he had forgotten to remove. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," said Lestrade with an attempt at dryness that could not entirely conceal relief. "I have brought you a case which, well, you may laugh at the yard, sir, but you will not laugh at this." "Lord only knows I would if I could." The gentleman stepped forward, bowing. "Edward Acton, sir, of Acton and Bristow, solicitors at Red Lion Court. I am here upon a matter that concerns my client's estate, but more pressingly the life of a man who is now," he faltered, producing the paper. "This will explain in brief." Holmes did not take the letter at once. His eyes had fixed upon the fellow's gloves, one worn and one immaculate. "A man who removes his right glove in a carriage," he remarked, "is answering notes by touch rather than sight, and therefore in haste. You came from Temple Bar in a four-wheeler, and your cabman's lamp is green with tarnish. Pray, be seated. Watson, the lamp, if you please." By the stronger light, the written account told its story in an economical, trembling hand. Mr. Percival Gower, confidential agent to certain banking houses and a man of singular discretion, had been found dead that afternoon in his private room at the chambers of Acton and Bristow. He had not answered the knock at 1 o'clock, nor at half. The clerks assumed he lunched within, as was his habit. At 3, with clients pressing, Mr. Acton himself had fetched the spare key, but the lock had resisted curiously, as though gummed. A carpenter was sent for. When at last the door was forced, Gower lay upon the carpet between desk and hearth, his eyes protruding, his features distorted by strangulation. No cord was discovered, no instrument that might have caused the mark that ran faint but definite beneath the angle of the jaw to the nape. The sash windows were closed and latched. The chimney showed no disturbance of ash. The inner door that led to a tiny records closet was bolted on the inside. The key of the main door was found in its lock upon the inner side, Locked within, with every reasonable avenue secured, Lestrade put in. And yet there was a witness to a visitor. A shadow, Mr. Holmes. A shadow that passed through the door. Holmes's brows lifted the smallest degree. Pray continue, Inspector. I am in your debt already. Lestrade produced his own notebook. Gower's clerk, a young fellow named Dodd, declares he saw at approximately 10 minutes to noon the outline of a man's head and shoulders cross the ground glass of the office door. Just there, where the etched letters make Gower private. The gas in the corridor was lit against the fog. The silhouette was distinct. Dodd swears it moved as a man would move in the room, though he'd not heard the latch turn, and the door, mind you, remained shut. The shadow seemed to pause at the desk, then, this is his very statement, passed through the panel and out, leaving the door as it had been tight-closed. He went to knock. He supposed Mr. Gower had no wish to be disturbed. Holmes had closed his eyes. The fingers of his long right hand made a soft drumming upon the arm of the chair. "A shadow requires a light," he murmured, "and glass to receive it. The light in the corridor, what of the light within the room?" "Turned low," Acton answered. Gower disliked glare. His clerk would complain of the old gentleman groping about like an owl, but he would have it so. The day was vilely dim. Was anything amiss? A thing trifling, perhaps? "The trifles, Mr. Acton." Acton swallowed. "If anything, Mr. Holmes, if anything, there was a smell. Not the odor of the fog, which is soot and wet wool. This was strange resinous. My partner called it varnish. The key, when we attempted it, the wards were as if smeared with some waxen substance. I had to wipe my fingers after." "Ha!" The exclamation was almost tender. Holmes rose at last and moved to the hearth, where he stooped to the coal scuttle, pinched a fragment of soft black between finger and thumb, and crushed it slowly. "You have a man dead in a locked room, a door that will not yield because its throat is choked, a witness to a shadow that passes as no living man can pass, and an odor of resin in the air. If I were writing for a circulating library, Watson, I would insert at this point a hint of the supernatural. Fortunately for Mr. Acton, I am not in that line." Lestrade bristled with the eagerness of a terrier that seizes the rat at last. "Then you will come." Holmes had turned the letter sideways, considering a brownish smear near the fold. He touched it, then brought the finger close to his nostril. "Shellac," he said, "and a trace of camphor. Common enough in any warehouse where specimens are preserved. Uncommon in a solicitor's office unless there has been recent meddling with no matter. Mr. Acton, you mentioned clients pressing at 3. Whom did Mr. Gower intend to see at noon?" Acton hesitated. "A lady, Mrs. Frances Burnham of Fitzroy Square, a widow. She is concerned in a settlement which Mr. Gower had managed for her late husband. She is of excellent character. The excellent character of a widow is a thing upon which I set no wagering odds," Holmes observed dryly. "You will not be offended, I hope, if I ask that your clerk Dodd remain at hand, and that nothing is moved in Mr. Gower's room. The smallest disarrangement may cost us a day." "Nothing has been touched beyond what the coroner insisted upon," Lestrade said. "And he, confound him, is as much at sea as any of us. There's no mark of entry anywhere, no rafter disturbed, the chimney swept last week and still neat. We are boasting, Mr. Holmes, of a ghost with a pair of strangler's hands." "A ghost," Holmes repeated with a glint that Watson, watching him with the old mixture of vexation and delight, recognized as the surest sign that the game had begun. "Ghosts leave no wax upon a key, Inspector, nor do they carry with them the smell of a lanternist's trade." He took up his Inverness and cap with a sudden decision that set Mrs. Hudson, who had crept to the landing, scurrying back down again lest she be caught listening. "Watson, your service, if you please." I should like eyes that see what an honest man thinks he sees, and hands steady enough to measure a thread on the edge of a splinter. Mr. Acton, you will accompany us to Red Lion Court. Inspector, you may keep your ghost if you like, provided you will allow me its shadow. Shadow, sir? Lestrade blinked. Holmes was already at the door. The shadow that passed through the door, he said over his shoulder, and told your clerk more than he understood. He paused upon the stair. We shall need matches, a tape, and if you can find it at the yard, a pane of ground glass of the sort used to replace the lower half of a respectable office door. If there is to be a ghost in the temple, Inspector, we may as well give it a mirror. Red Lion Court lies like a thin pocket between the traffic of Fleet Street and the gloom of the temple, a flagged throat where the fog settles as in a well. We passed under its arch to find a constable posted at the stair and 2 or 3 idle spectators hazed into blotches by the lamps. Mr. Acton led us up to the first landing, where a narrow corridor ran upon a line of doors with ground glass in their upper panels. One, lettered P. Gower, private, bore a bruised place at the lock and the fresh scar of a carpenter's chisel. Even before Acton produced his key, the air told its tale, something sweet and resinous pricking at the back of the nose, as spirits of camphor will do when a nurse opens her bottle. Holmes paused without entering. He slipped his tape from his pocket and made a trifling measurement from the floor to the center of the etched lettering. 5 feet 4 to the capital of Gower, he said softly, and then set the tape to the outer lamp, gauging the height of its globe and the distance to the jamb. The corridor is a theater, Inspector. The audience merely chose the wrong seat. He went in upon his toes. The room was moderate in size, desk set across the window, hearth at the right, a high press of tin-bound deed boxes upon the left, and an inner door to the records closet beyond. The carpet still showed the dent where the poor fellow's head had lain. A chalked outline told its own crude story. Holmes moved as if across ice, placing his feet into his own imagination of the killer's steps. He did not at first look at the mark upon the carpet, but at the door from within, where the key still rested in the lock, with a smear about the wards like honey gone hard. With a penknife, he shaved the faintest curl from the deposit and held it to the lamplight. It gleamed amber and then dulled. He touched it with a match head, brought it near his face, and nodded. Shellac cut with camphor. A touch will set hard in the cold. Your carpenter earned his fee. Lestrade sniffed at the air with the honesty of a man who must trust his nose when his wits fail him. And what was it doing here? Primarily, said Holmes, clogging what would otherwise present as a keyhole. But it also tells us that the hand which brought it had recently fumbled with a lantern slide or some allied apparatus. Do not trouble yourself, Inspector. We shall come to it. Mr. Acton had fetched the clerk. Young Dodd stood in the doorway with his cap crushed between his fingers, a pale moustache at half-mast upon his upper lip, and the anxious candor of a junior who fears to be made ridiculous. Holmes addressed him with the gentleness he reserves for those whose only crime is to have seen too much and understood too little. You sit where? Out to the front, sir. Cross the landing in the clerk's room. He pointed. There's a sightline, sir. When Mr. Gower's door is shut, you can still see the lower bit where the glass starts. And at 10 minutes before noon, you observed a shadow. Yes, sir. A head and shoulders went over the letters, plain as a play. It moved, well, like this. He, overcome by diffidence, made the motion with his cap, a figure gliding left to right, pausing at the center, then dipping out of sight. I never heard the latch. After I knocked and he didn't answer, I took it he had a client and didn't want me. Holmes took from the mantel a glass paperweight, set it upon the desk's corner, and then extinguished the room's burner until the chamber lay in a comfortable dusk. The corridor lamp threw a milky glow through the door panel. "Watson, oblige me. Stand in the corridor 2 paces back of the lamp, then pass your hand close across the glass. After that, pass it a yard away." I did as directed. Closest to the glass, my hand made a crisp black bar that bit upon the etched letters. A yard off, the bar blurred and seemed to swim, an insubstantial thing that nevertheless suggested movement within the room rather than without. Holmes observed with a small grunt of satisfaction. "You see, Inspector, the clerk's shadow inside the office is a question of parallax and expectation. Stand where a man stands daily, and you will swear by what he thinks he sees. Now, Dodd, before you return to your desk, did you notice aught about the lock? The key was, well, gummy, sir. Mr. Acton had to scrape it." Holmes, with that quick pounce which gave him always the air of a hawk stooping, dropped to one knee by the skirting board directly beneath the lock. He teased from the wood with a pin the tiniest bead, no bigger than a pin's head, of brown resin sunk into the grain. Then at the hearth he crouched again, not at the grate, but at the fender's inner edge, where a faint grey scrape marred the polish. He laid his tape along the floor from the door to the desk, then to the outline where Gower had fallen, and finally to a chair whose front left foot bore a greasy crescent, as if something taut had rubbed and leaped. He smelled the crescent and smiled with only half his mouth. "Camphor again. We're in the company of a tidy workman." Lestrade, who had begun to suspect a kind of conjuring, jabbed a thumb at the inner door, and the closet bolted from within. "The charwoman says we've left it so." Holmes examined the bolt. It lay home in its socket with a slight burr of brass upon the tongue. "Worked of late with a string passed through the screw hole," he murmured, indicating the faintest polish around the lower screw where a filament might lodge, and play, drawn perhaps, and then shaken free by a tap. He set his cheek near the panel and breathed. "No odor. Very good." He turned to Acton. "Mr. Gower's habits are our next necessity. Did he smoke in here? Keep mothballs? Any business with naturalists, curators, photographers?" "None that I know, Mr. Holmes. He would take snuff at times, the common whiffin. No pipe. He detested smoke upon the papers." Holmes lifted the coal scuttle's lid and gave a short laugh. "Then who put cigar ash here at 11 this morning?" He held up between forefinger and thumb a shred of dark unburnt leaf tipped with a pale fragment. "Not Cuban. A strong regalia made in Clerkenwell for the cheaper clubs. Your Mr. Gower was visited by a man who smokes where he pleases and pays little heed to the niceties of other men's offices." A footman's cough sounded from the corridor, light and well-bred. Mrs. Frances Burnham had arrived under Lestrade's summons, close-veiled, the corner of her black glove pressed hard at her throat. The inspector kept her gently at the threshold, while Holmes changed nothing in his tone and everything in his attention. "You were expected at noon," he said. "You did not keep the appointment." Her voice, when it came, was steady through the veil. "I was delayed. There was a messenger at my door from Mr. Gower, begging me to move the hour to half. I came then, but the clerk said Mr. Gower would not be disturbed." Holmes's eyes flickered. "A messenger. Describe him." "A small man in a shabby frock. He did not remove his hat. He spoke with a foreign accent, perhaps German. He bore a card with Mr. Gower's name upon it." Holmes's hand opened. "You kept the card?" No, I am ashamed to say I burned it in my grate when I learned what had happened. It distressed me." "Your distress is real," Holmes said, and for an instant the keen face softened. "One last question. Have you any acquaintance with men who make optical entertainments, magic lantern shows for charitable halls, or who deal in photographic plates?" "None, sir." He bowed her out with a promise that she should be fetched again if needed. When she had gone, he stood very still, his head lowered, the long fingers tented. A messenger that came from Mr. Gower, and yet did not. An ash that belongs to a clubman with a short temper. Shellac at a lock, camphor in the air, and a shadow obligingly passing through a door at 10 minutes to 12. He drew a slow breath, as if a faint music had come to him at last. Inspector, you will forgive me if I ask that a man be sent at once along Holborn to the cheaper opticians' shops and the lanternist suppliers. I will furnish the names. We require a slip of ground glass, 6 by 9, the sort used to replace door panels, and if a shopkeeper remembers a gentleman purchasing shellac and camphor together this week, pray his description. In the meantime, I shall make up a small experiment of my own. What experiment? Lestrade demanded. Holmes raised the paperweight and set it not upon the desk but half a foot from the door, where the corridor lamp could lay a pale square around it. To see, Inspector, he said, how far a man will follow a shadow, and whether another man may not behind that shadow coil a cord and leave the least trace in London. The constable had been instructed to admit no further callers, and thus the landing fell silent save for the faint drip of the fog upon the panes. Holmes, with the quick precision of a surgeon laying out his instruments, arranged the objects he had gathered. The shaving of resin, the tape, the shred of ash, and his own small box of chemicals. He did not yet speak. His eyes traveled instead from door to desk, from desk to hearth and back again, as though he rehearsed the unseen performance of the crime. Watson, uneasy at the oppressive stillness of the office, busied himself with his notes. Lestrade, less patient, tapped the butt of his cane against his boot. "You have your trifles, Mr. Holmes," he said, "but we are no nearer to the fellow who could come and go like smoke." "On the contrary, Inspector," Holmes returned, "we are close enough that I can hear his step upon these boards. The trouble lies not in his vanishing, but in our minds refusing to accept the path he used. The shadow is no phantom. It is a device, and every device requires a hand to contrive it." He drew from his pocket a small lens and crouched once more by the lock. The hardened smear glistened under the magnification with tiny ridges where fibers had pressed. "Note this, Watson. A thread, horsehair perhaps, once passed here. Its end must have carried weight, or no mark would remain." He rose swiftly. "You spoke, Inspector, of a ghost with strangler's hands. Yet the truth may be simpler. A cord worked from behind the victim as he bent over his desk, tightened in silence, and removed in haste." "Then where is this cord?" demanded Lestrade. "We searched every inch." Holmes's reply was cut short by the return of the constable, who bore a slip of paper from a runner sent to Holborn. Holmes read it at a glance, his eyes kindling. "As I expected. A purchase of shellac, camphor, and a lantern slide plate recorded 3 days past at a dealer in Chancery Lane. The customer was described as middle-aged, foreign in manner, and smoking a strong cigar." "Then we have him," Lestrade exclaimed. "We have his description, not his name, but the noose tightens." Holmes folded the slip and tucked it away. "Come, Watson, let us revisit the carpet by the hearth." I knelt beside him while he drew my attention to a faint indentation, circular and small, as though some object had pressed there but been swiftly removed. "A lamp base," he murmured, "set low to cast its light against the glass of the door. Combine that with a figure moved outside the panel, and the clerk within believes he sees life where there is none. Thus is a phantom born." Lestrade rubbed his chin. "But why all this play with shadows? Why not simply walk in and out?" "Because, Inspector, our murderer required privacy," Holmes said sharply. "He could not risk the clerk observing an entrance at the fatal hour. Instead, he left the impression of a presence without, while he himself was within. By the time poor Gower was dead, The office seemed already closed and undisturbed. Acton, pale but intent, spoke for the first time since re-entering. But how was the lock secured? If he were within, how did he depart? Holmes's hand hovered near the bolt of the inner closet. The answer lies here. A string through the screw hole drew the bolt. The murderer, once finished, withdrew by that smaller door into the passage of the records room. There must be a second exit concealed amongst the presses. Mr. Acton, you will oblige me by fetching your partner. I should like to know whether any door at the rear has lately been unfastened. Acton obeyed, and within moments returned with a grey-headed man in barrister's wig and gown. There is, Mr. Holmes, the elder man admitted reluctantly, a disused stair leading to the cellars. Locked these 20 years, yet last week I found the padlock sprung. I thought little of it. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Then we have our stage door, Watson. The ghost did not vanish. He descended. He straightened suddenly, his whole form alight with resolve. We must act before the trail cools. Inspector, secure this chamber precisely as it stands. Remove nothing. I will have the yard watch each lanternist supplier within a mile. Our foreign friend will return to complete his masquerade. Of that I am certain, and when he does, we shall be ready. Holmes swept his tape and lens into his pocket, cast one last glance about the dim chamber, and moved toward the door. I followed, notebook clutched in hand, struggling to piece together the picture that in his mind was already complete. Lestrade, half convinced and half vexed, muttered as he joined us on the stair. Shadows, resin, ash, and a bolt on a closet door. God help me, Holmes, but if you make a murderer out of such scraps, I shall swear the devil himself guides your hand. Holmes gave no reply. His gaze was fixed upon the fog outside, where the lamps guttered like weary eyes. Not the devil, Inspector, he said at last softly. Only a man who understands how much the world believes what it thinks it sees. With that, he set his stride toward Baker Street, his face sharp with anticipation, as though already rehearsing the next move in a game whose end he foresaw, though the rest of us still groped among the shadows. The cab wheels rattled us back through the misty arteries of London, and all the while Holmes remained in a silence that was anything but idle. His fingers tapped an inaudible rhythm upon his knee, his eyes half closed, as though the city itself were whispering its answers to him. I longed to press him with questions, but I had learned through long apprenticeship that interruption at such moments was as fruitless as pebbles at a locked door. He would speak when the pattern in his mind had fully revealed itself. At Baker Street he sprang from the hansom before it had quite stopped, his cloak swinging behind him, and mounted the steps 2 at a time. I followed, somewhat breathless, to find him already at his chemistry table, uncorking a vial of spirit and preparing his little burners. He placed the shaving of resin upon a glass slide, heating it carefully until the air filled with its pungent vapor. Shellac mixed with camphor, just as I suspected. It hardens rapidly, forming a film capable of sealing a keyhole or stiffening a fiber. Our man is a craftsman of shadows, Watson, a lanternist by trade or by training. He sought to conjure an apparition, to buy himself minutes of seclusion, and to leave his audience persuaded that the room was both occupied and inviolate. A neat deception. And the cigar ash? I ventured. Holmes set the slide aside and took from his drawer his monograph on tobacco. The regalia of Clerkenwell? Coarse, pungent, favored by men of modest means who yet wish to give themselves an air of bravado. It stains the fingers a yellowish brown within a week. We shall know our visitor by his hands. He began to pace, his lean frame swaying slightly, his eyes fixed on the carpet. Let us reconstruct. Gower receives a visitor, a man who has procured shellac, camphor, and a lantern-slide plate. He smokes heavily. He is foreign, middle-aged, and has some knowledge of optical illusion. He sends a false message to Mrs. Burnham, ensuring she arrives too late to interrupt him. He enters by the disused stair, perhaps with a duplicate key or by forcing the lock days earlier. He sets his lamp within the chamber, arranges the resin to gum the door, and strangles Gower silently with a cord. Then, with the aid of his shadow play, he deceives the clerk into believing that Gower was still about his business. Finally, he secures the closet bolt by string, passes through the records room, and escapes. It is bold, Watson, and it is intricate. But why? I asked. Should anyone employ such elaborate trickery when a simpler murder might have sufficed? Ah! Holmes turned sharply, his eyes blazing. That is the crux. Murder alone was not his aim. He wished to delay discovery, to purchase hours in which to act upon the fruits of Gower's death. What did the man guard so closely in those deed boxes? What settlement, what bond, what paper of value that a widow's claim could threaten or a foreign interest might desire? Before I could reply, Lestrade was announced below. He entered with his usual mixture of determination and impatience, a dusting of fog upon his whiskers. My men have scoured the dealers in Holborn. One fellow remembered the customer plain enough, thick-set, graying hair brushed back, scar upon the left cheek. He bought a lantern, slides, and the shellac, paid in sovereigns. Ask too many questions about ground glass for any honest lanternist, if you ask me. The shopman thought him German or Austrian. Name given was Herr Vogel. No address. Holmes's expression scarcely altered, though I could see the thrill of confirmation light his face. Herr Vogel indeed, a bird who prefers to flit through doors. Very good, Inspector. Did your man remark upon his hands? Stained yellow to the knuckle. Holmes's long fingers snapped once. Excellent. We begin to breathe the same air as our quarry. Lestrade, however, was not content. But the motive, Mr. Holmes. Scotland Yard cannot proceed upon shadows and resin alone. What does this Vogel gain from throttling a respectable solicitor? That, said Holmes softly, is the question we must resolve before the night is out. He turned to me. Watson, you will oblige me by examining Gower's correspondence when we return to Red Lion Court. Somewhere in those files lies the prize that drew this shadow worker into the net. Inspector, post 2 men to watch the rear stair. If Vogel returns to retrieve what he missed, we must be there to greet him. We returned once more to the chambers, the fog lying thicker, muffling our steps and swallowing the lamps. The constable saluted stiffly, reporting no disturbance. Inside, the air was heavy with that same resinous scent, though less sharp now, as though it had been absorbed by the draperies. Holmes directed Lestrade to station his men below, and then began a methodical search of the deed boxes, lifting each tin case with delicate precision. I assisted, noting the neatness of Gower's files, each labeled with client names, settlements, and estates. Holmes's eye paused upon one box more than the rest. It bore the label Burnham Trust, Private. He lifted it gently, tested its weight, and set it upon the desk. Observe, Watson. The lock has been tampered with, no doubt in haste, for the scratch marks are fresh. Our intruder sought something here. He opened the case with a deft turn of his pick. Within lay sheaves of papers bound in red tape, each concerning the late Mr. Burnham's estate. Among them, Holmes drew forth a packet, slit and resealed with clumsy hand. He examined the seal with his lens. Broken within the hour of Gower's death, I should judge. And what do we find? The document within was a bond of considerable value, payable to Mrs. Frances Burnham upon completion of a certain railway contract abroad. Yet across its margin ran fresh annotations in German script, noting figures and dates wholly unknown to the English parties. Holmes's voice cut the silence. There is our motive. Vogel is no petty thief. He is an agent seeking to divert funds of international significance. Gower stood in his way, thus the cord, the shadow, and the vanished door. At that instant a cry came from the stair. A scuffle, the crash of a truncheon, and the stamp of boots echoed upward. Lestrade dashed out, revolver in hand, while Holmes, with a sudden leap of energy, was at his side. I followed, my heart thudding, to see a dark figure struggling in the lamplight of the lower landing. One constable clung to his arm, the other to his throat, while the man twisted with desperate strength, striking out with fists yellowed at the knuckles. The fog curled about him, his features half obscured, but the scar on the cheek was plain. "Vogel!" Holmes cried, his voice ringing with triumph. "The shadow has substance after all." The man wrenched free with a roar, hurling one constable against the wall, and dashed for the archway to the court. Shots rang out, muffled by the fog, and in an instant he was swallowed into the London night. We were left with the echoes of pursuit, the acrid smell of gunpowder, and the certainty that the phantom we sought was no longer content to haunt doors, but had shown himself a man of flesh and blood, and one not easily caught. The sound of Vogel's flight still rang in my ears as we gathered upon the stair, the echoes of pursuit swallowed almost instantly by the fog-heavy court. Lestrade's men pounded after him, their boots striking the cobbles with all the eagerness of duty. Yet even as we reached the archway, Holmes raised a hand to halt me. "No, Watson," he said quietly, his voice steady, while his eyes still glittered with the thrill of the chase. "The fog is his ally. He will vanish into it as neatly as he conjured shadows through a door. To pursue blindly is to court futility. Let Lestrade expend his energy. We will require ours for subtler work." The inspector returned minutes later, breathless, his temper riding high. "Slipped us like a weasel, curse him!" The devil's luck was in it. Down Fetter Lane he went, then gone, as if London opened its maw and swallowed him whole. He glared at Holmes with frustration. "We had him, sir, and now he is mist and smoke again." Holmes's reply was calm. "Not smoke, Inspector, substance, and substance leaves traces. Let him vanish into the night. He has left behind what matters most. The document he sought, and the evidence of his hand upon it, remain in our custody." He guided us back to the dim chambers, where the deed box still lay open upon the desk. The bond, with its German annotations, seemed now almost to pulse with significance, a silent testament to the motive that had driven Vogel to such elaborate measures. Holmes regarded it for a long moment, then slipped it into an inner pocket of his coat with a care that told me he meant to guard it as closely as any crown jewel. Lestrade bristled at once. "See here, Holmes, that is evidence belonging to the Yard." "Evidence, yes, but evidence that Vogel will risk all to recover. In his hands it is danger. In mine it is bait. We shall use it to draw him back to us. Consider, Inspector, that Vogel is not a man who commits murder for mere diversion. He is employed, by whom we shall learn in due course, to secure this document. He has failed once, and his masters will not permit him to fail twice. He will try again, and when he does, we shall be waiting." The inspector grumbled, but could not dispute the reasoning. He left us to confer with his men, while Holmes drew me aside. "Watson, you observed the man closely. Did you note the scar?" "Plainly. A deep line from temple to jaw." "Good. A mark such as that is not easily concealed, nor forgotten by those who have seen it. Tomorrow you will pay a discreet call upon Dr. James Mortimer of the London Hospital. He once served in Vienna and will remember patients of such description. Meanwhile, I must follow another trail, the shadow maker himself. There are but few establishments in London that supply lantern apparatus in such quality, and Vogel has already revealed his haunts. With a little coaxing, the dealers may tell us more than he intended." It was near midnight when we at last returned to Baker Street. Mrs. Hudson, though wearied by the hour, had kept a pot of tea warm, and we took it in the sitting-room while the fog pressed ghost-like against the panes. Holmes did not drink, but paced restlessly, the steam from the pot wreathing about him as though echoing the smoke of his thoughts. At last he paused, striking his fist lightly against the mantel. "We must think, Watson, not of Vogel alone, but of the hand behind him. These annotations in German script hint at interests far beyond Mrs. Burnham's widowhood. They speak of railways abroad, of finance, of international entanglements. The theft of this bond would beggar her claim, but enrich another beyond reckoning. Vogel is but the shadow. We must bring to light the figure that casts it." I reflected that Mrs. Burnham, so pale and composed beneath her veil, might be caught unawares in a game of continental intrigue larger than her quiet house in Fitzroy Square could suggest. I said as much, and Holmes inclined his head gravely. "Indeed, Watson. Yet I suspect she knows nothing. She was but the lure, the plausible pretext. Vogel needed her appointment to explain his presence should he be interrupted. That she received a false message proves she was considered no more than a pawn. Still, pawns have a way of determining the outcome when the board is near its end." The following morning dawned bleak, with the fog lingering as though reluctant to lift its veil from the city. Holmes dispatched me at once to the hospital, while he vanished upon errands of his own. My inquiries bore little fruit at first. The scar, it seemed, was a common badge of rough living. "But, doctor," Mortimer recalled a patient years before, a machinist from Munich named Ernst Vogel, who had been treated after a factory accident. He described him as secretive, irascible, and of formidable strength despite his injury. That he had since come to London did not surprise him, for Vogel had spoken of English industry as a fertile field. When I returned with this confirmation, I found Holmes awaiting me with a gleam of satisfaction. "Excellent, Watson. We are upon the same man. I have traced his lantern purchase further to a lodging-house near Clerkenwell, where he is said to rent a small room under the name of Schmidt. The landlady noted his absences at odd hours, and his habit of returning with his pockets reeking of camphor and cigar smoke. Most significant of all, she mentioned that last evening, before our encounter, he paid his rent in gold sovereigns and hinted at an imminent journey abroad." Holmes paused, his gaze distant. "He means to flee, but not without the bond. That document is his passport. Without it, he dare not return to his masters. Therefore, Watson, he must strike again." At that very instant, Lestrade burst through the door, his face alight with news. "Holmes, the watchman at Chancery Lane reports a man answering Vogel's description prowling near the rear entrance of Red Lion Court not an hour ago. He vanished before the constable could take him, but there is no mistaking him. He is circling the bait." Holmes's expression grew taut with purpose. "So the trap begins to close. We shall return to the chambers this evening. The fog will serve him, as he believes, but we shall give the shadow its due light. Watson, ready your revolver. Vogel has shown already that he kills without compunction, and when next he passes through a door, it shall not be as easily as before. And thus, with the day waning into another fog-bound night, we prepared ourselves for the inevitable clash, knowing that the phantom we hunted was no longer an illusion upon glass, but a man desperate enough to gamble his life upon one last throw of the dice. The dusk deepened swiftly, the fog once more gathering in the narrow courts like a conspirator anxious to cloak the night's business. When Holmes, Lestrade, and I arrived again at Red Lion Court, the lamps glowed only as faint halos in the gloom, and the buildings loomed like blurred sentinels. The constables, whom Lestrade had stationed earlier, were stiff with the cold but reported nothing. save the shifting of shadows along the walls. Holmes gave them precise instructions to hold their posts, their eyes trained upon the rear stair, and then ushered us within the chambers, where the air still carried that resinous taint. Holmes moved with the careful deliberation of a chess master arranging his board. He placed the deed box upon the desk once more, leaving it open so that its contents might tempt the intruder. The bond, however, he did not return, but slipped into his breast pocket. Instead, he substituted a bundle of papers weighted with blank sheets, tying them with red tape to resemble the original packet. His hands were steady, his eyes alight with that peculiar fire I had come to recognize, the anticipation of pitting his mind against another's at the most dangerous point of play. "We must imagine ourselves the prey," he said softly. "Vogel believes he stalks an empty chamber watched only by credulous clerks. He will creep by the rear stair, force the closet, and slip within. His eye will be drawn to this box. He will think to secure the bond and vanish. At that moment, gentlemen, we must be ready to close the net." Lestrade's impatience bristled. "Then we should set men in here, hidden behind the presses." "He will never suspect." Holmes shook his head. "Too clumsy, Inspector. He is wary enough. One creak of leather or rasp of breath and he is gone again as last night. No, we must let him believe himself alone. Watson and I shall remain silent, and in shadow, you, Inspector, will place your men without. The moment Vogel emerges, the trap will spring. I trust your revolver is primed, Watson." I assured him it was, though in truth my hand tightened upon the butt as I considered what peril the night might bring. The memory of Vogel's brutal strength and desperate blows against the constables was still fresh, and I wondered what madness might seize him when he realized the deception. Holmes extinguished the main burner until only a faint glow remained from the corridor lamp seeping through the door panel. The chamber was plunged into a dim half-light, and the silence grew heavy. We took our positions. Holmes crouched near the hearth, where he could see both door and desk. I stationed beside the press with my revolver ready, and Lestrade slipping out to arrange his cordon. Then we waited. The minutes dragged with agonizing slowness. The tick of a distant clock echoed like a hammer upon my nerves. More than once I fancied I heard a stealthy step upon the stair, only for the sound to prove nothing but the creak of settling boards. Holmes, however, remained utterly still, his profile cut sharp against the faint gleam of the fire, his eyes fixed unwaveringly upon the inner door. At length it came, the faintest scrape, metallic yet muffled, as though a thin filament were drawn across brass. Holmes's hand lifted a fraction in warning. I scarcely dared to breathe. Slowly, inch by inch, the bolt of the closet stirred in its socket and slid back, drawn by an unseen thread. Then, with a soft push, the door moved inward, and a shadow spilled into the room. Vogel stood outlined against the gloom, his scarred cheek catching the dim light, his figure stooped but powerful. He carried in one hand a small lamp, shaded so that its beam fell directly upon the desk, leaving the corners of the room in darkness. His other hand held a short cord, coiled loosely like a strangler's noose waiting for its victim. The sight sent a chill along my spine. He moved with astonishing assurance, as though rehearsed 100 times, going directly to the deed box. His stained fingers fumbled at the tape, tugging free the packet of papers. For a moment he examined it with greedy intensity. Then he muttered an oath in German, low but distinct, and thrust the bundle into his coat. He turned to leave, his steps as silent as when he entered. Holmes sprung. In one motion he was upon him, his lean-in frame striking with the precision of a striking hawk. Vogel roared, dropping his lamp, which sputtered and guttered upon the carpet. The two men grappled, the scarred face contorted with fury, as Vogel swung his fists with crushing force. Holmes twisted, evading the worst of the blows, but the man's strength was formidable. I darted forward, revolver raised, yet dared not fire for fear of striking my friend. "Watson! His arm!" Holmes gasped. I seized Vogel's wrist as it swung toward Holmes's throat, wrenching it back with all my might. The cord he held slipped free, falling to the floor. At that instant, Lestrade and his men burst through the corridor door, revolvers drawn, their boots thundering. Vogel lunged toward the open passage, his strength undiminished, hurling me aside like a child's toy. He crashed through the doorway but found himself faced by the leveled weapons of the constables. For a moment he stood, chest heaving, his eyes wild, cornered at last. Then, with a guttural cry, he hurled himself against them. Shots rang out, one bullet striking the wall, another grazing his arm. Blood spattered, yet he fought on, dragging one constable down in his fury. It required 4 men to subdue him, their clubs raining blows, until at last he sagged to the floor, his breath rasping, his bonus ends bound at last. Holmes straightened, his face pale but composed. "Alive, Inspector, alive." He must speak. Dead men tell no tales, and Vogel's tale has yet to be heard. Lestrade wiped his brow, exhaling deeply. "You have him, Holmes, by all that's holy, you have him, though I doubt we'll get much from that brute beyond curses." Holmes's eyes glittered with something more than triumph. "On the contrary, Inspector, the man is but a shadow of a larger figure. He was sent, employed, directed. That bond was not his to claim, but his master's. And before we are done, we shall know who that master is." Vogel groaned, his scarred face twisted in defiance, but the fight had drained from him. As they hauled him upright, Holmes bent to retrieve the fallen lamp and the counterfeit bundle of papers. He brushed the dust from his coat with a curious serenity, then turned to me. "Watson, you see now how shadows may be caught when one provides the proper light. But we are not yet at the heart of the matter. Vogel is a tool. The true hand that guides him remains concealed. And it is that hand we must draw forth if we are to end this business." With Vogel bound and sullen between 2 constables, we left the chambers. The fog swallowed us as before, but this time we carried within our grasp not a phantom, but a man of flesh and blood, whose capture promised revelations that would reach far beyond the narrow court, where a shadow once passed through a door. We conveyed Vogel to the yard under heavy guard, the man sullen and bleeding at the sleeve where Lestrade's bullet had grazed him. In the harsh light of the charge room, his brutish strength seemed for the first time circumscribed by iron and routine. The clank of the cuffs as they were exchanged for a cell's staples had a music that I confess lifted my spirits. Lestrade, all official once more, set about the preliminaries with commendable dispatch, while Holmes stood aside, studying our prisoner with a cold attentiveness that I had seen unnerve subtler men than Vogel. A search of the fellow's pockets produced small but telling items: a flattened coil of fine braided cord, a key blank with the faintest brown sheen upon its wards, a twist of oiled tissue containing grains of amber resin, and from the inner pocket a folded slip torn from a shipping circular. Messrs. G. Keppel and Company, Continental Freight Agents, Mincing Lane, with a penciled hour beside it. Thursday. 4. Holmes's nostrils dilated almost imperceptibly as he smelt the blank key and held it to the gas. "Shellac print," he murmured. "He has taken impressions as a locksmith takes the inside of a tooth. Our shadow worker is nothing if not thorough." Lestrade brought Vogel into the inspector's room for questioning. The man sat with his hands on the table, his eyes hooded, his jaw thrust forward in the obstinate line of the professional hard case. Holmes addressed him in excellent German, swift and low. "You have failed, Vogel. The document is not yours. If you remain silent, you go to the gallows for Gower, and your master will forget your name. Speak, and you may yet cross a sea." For an instant the heavy lids flickered at the word master and again at sea. Then the jaw set like granite. He spat a phrase in which English dogs and a riper Saxon epit commingled and lapsed into silence. Holmes seemed neither disappointed nor surprised. He leaned back, his eyes half closed, as though the man were a specimen under a bell. "You trembled at Keppel," he observed in English, turning the shipping slip with a finger. "You will meet him then, or someone of his house. No matter. If the shadow will not name the light, we shall draw the light to the shadow." He rose with sudden decision. "Come, Watson. Inspector, keep him warm and obstinate. He will serve us better as bait than as witness. I shall send you a paragraph to appear in the evening editions and a second for the morning. Be good enough to see that they are printed as writ." The fog had thinned to a damp wool pulled across the lamps. Holmes hailed a cab and gave a rapid series of directions that puzzled the driver as much as they did me. First to a Fleet Street office whose editor greeted him like an old and dangerous acquaintance, then to a little agency off Cheapside where he scrolled, in a clerkly hand not his own, a notice for commercial travellers. Lastly to Mincing Lane, whose counting-houses were shuttering for the night. At the door of Keppel and Company, he merely paused, drew a match as if to light a cigarette, and held its sulphurous flare low against the brass plate. When it was out, he sniffed his fingers and smiled. "Koppelvarnish," he said. "A Teutonic preference. They have dressed their sign to impress, and the porter smokes a pipe strong enough to dress a sail." At Baker Street, he put pen to paper at once, the phrases flowing in that precise, unemotional manner he uses when he wishes the public to do his work. The first paragraph announced in an obscure corner of the social column that the matter of the Burnham Trust had been adjusted, and that the principal instrument, now in safe custody, would be presented at noon on the morrow to the bank's transfer clerk. The second, a modest advertisement in the commercial sheets, offered the services of a confidential messenger, experienced in delicate instruments, to convey sealed packets to financial houses at short notice, and gave an address not 100 yards from Keppel's. "You will forgive the theatricals, Watson," he said, blotting. "I require two things. First, to alarm the party that has employed Vogel into believing that his prize will tomorrow pass beyond his reach. Second, to give that party a plausible means of retaking it. When men think their fortune rides in a paper, they will risk their necks to snatch the envelope that seems to hold it." Before I could answer, Mrs. Hudson ushered in a visitor whose presence took me aback. Mrs. Frances Burnham, veiled as before, but with a tremor in the hands that held her muff. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice low but controlled. "This was thrust beneath my door an hour ago." She handed him a half-sheet of cheap notepaper, upon which words had been gummed from a newspaper. "Madam, you are warned. If the bond is touched, it will bring fire upon your house. Burnham will burn. Be wise." He held the sheet to the lamp. The gum had browned slightly at one edge. A faint bluish smear marked the margin. "Copying pencil," he said, "such as clerks use. The paper smells of ipecacuanha, dispensary stock, or a chemist's drawer. A crude threat, yet it tells us two things. Our adversary watches the lady's house, and he wishes her to believe that the danger lies near her, not in the city. False emphasis is a clumsy tool." He reassured her with a courtesy that never deserts him where a gentlewoman is concerned. "Your courage does you credit, madam. You will be yet wiser if you follow my instructions exactly. Tonight you will not sleep at Fitzroy Square. You will take a bag and go to your cousin. Yes, the tints of the one at Bayswater. You see, I keep accounts. In a cab I shall send within the hour. I will place a plain-clothed man in your parlor to receive any further communications. Above all, you will speak to no stranger and open to no one whose face you have not known 3 months. We stand between you and your enemies, and we shall not fail." When she had gone, heartened by his tone as many have been before her, he turned to me with that quick half-smile that is the nearest thing to warmth. He permits his triumph. "You see the lines run together, Watson." The note was put by a watchman whose day is spent among copying pencils and emetics. The shipping slip names Capel. The varnish on the key tells us of shellac workers. The German hand on the margin of the bond points to one who is at his ease where Englishmen are not. All roads lead toward the same counting house. "And yet," I said, for a thought had pricked me all afternoon, "our intruder knew the disposition of Gower's rooms and the existence of the rear stair. He tampered with the Burnham box and came and went at hours when a stranger would be marked. He had help within." Holmes's eyes shot to mine, keen and pleased. "Excellent, my dear fellow. The simplest instrument is often the most neglected. Yes, a confederate, likely not a partner. Conscience or cowardice would have shaken, but a clerk with debts, a porter with a taste for sovereigns, a charwoman with a son who wants a place. Tomorrow we shall determine which." He sent me to my rest with orders as precise as a field marshal's. At 10 I was to station myself within sight of the bank's transfer lobby. At 11 he would take up his post opposite Capel's door under the guise of a messenger seeking hire. Lestrade would hold Vogel tight and an hour before noon cause it to be known in certain public houses that the Burnham paper was to be carried from Red Lion Court. When the fox hears hounds to his left and sees pheasants to his right, Holmes said with a yawn he did not feel, "He shows the hedge he favors." The morning brought a wan light and a damp that pierced the bones. I took my place among the clerks and errand boys who haunt a city doorway for the pleasure of being jostled by their betters, and watched the comings and goings of sober men with briefcases and anxious wrinkles. At 11, a nondescript person in a mourning band upon his hat, too heavy, I thought, for sincerity, passed twice along the opposite pavement, pausing each time to glance into the bank as if calculating his distance. His hands, gloved, were held oddly stiff, as if to hide a stain. When I turned my head to follow him, I caught across the street the unmistakable line of Holmes's shoulders under a shabby porter's jacket, his chin sunk, his eyes alive. A boy sped by with an evening bill, "Burnham Trust Instrument, removal to bank at noon." And the nondescript man quickened his pace in answer, vanishing toward Mincing Lane as though a string had been jerked. Holmes did not look at me. He did not need to. I knew the game had entered its end, and that somewhere between the counting house that smelt of copal and the lobby where sober men signed their names, the hand that had guided a shadow through a door would at last be forced to show itself in the light. Noon in the city has a peculiar hush of its own, compounded of urgency and restraint, the tread of men who must be somewhere at once, yet dare not show the haste that betrays anxiety. I felt that quiet strain about me as I kept my post near the transfer counter, my hat brim low, my eyes upon the outer doors where messengers come and go like beads on a string. The clerk at the ledgers, a neat fellow with cuffs turned just so, checked the pendulum of the regulator with an instinctive glance and wetted his pencil. The hour was upon us. A porter passed with a whispered word for the clerk. The man nodded and reached to straighten a sheaf of blanks upon which authorizations are copied. My eye, for no very rational reason, fixed upon the pencil in his hand, a common copying pencil, the sort that leaves a faint bluish smear if the page is damped. A triviality, no more. And yet the cheap note thrust beneath Mrs. Burnham's door had, as Holmes observed, carried that same ghost of blue. I told myself that 1,000 such pencils served in 1,000 city offices. I could not shake the prickle it set between my shoulders. The doors parted. A messenger entered. Sober livery, cap with a narrow band of black that seemed to my eye too deliberate, as though grief were worn as a password. He came straight to the counter and placed upon it an envelope of stout paper, Acton and Bristow, with a seal impressed in wax. "From Mr. Acton, sir," he announced, and produced a covering note. "Kindly deliver to bearer the principal instrument in the matter of the Burnham Trust now in your custody for immediate perusal prior to the noon presentation. E. Acton." The clerk lifted the note, nodded respectfully, and with that air of a man correctly performing a familiar ritual, reached for the drawer where such deposits lie. If I hesitated then, it was not from any clear remembrance of instruction, but from the faintest breath that seemed to accompany the note, a medicinal whiff I could not mistake. I have handled physic too long to be deceived by ipecac. I laid my hand as if idly upon the counter. "A moment," I said in my most commonplace tone. "You will oblige me, my good fellow," to the messenger, "by writing your name and employer upon this slip. I am a stickler for forms where values of this magnitude are concerned." He stared at me, then at the clerk, and made as if to take the pencil that lay upon the desk. "No," I added smoothly, producing from my pocket a steel pen. "Ink, if you please. Copying pencils are the plague of the age." He shot me a swift, ugly look. His gloved fingers twitched. Then he set the pen to paper. The hand that governed it was awkward, its loops too long for an office runner, and its downstrokes the heavy strokes of a man drilled in German script. He wrote, "James Hart, Capel and Company," and even as he wrote, the clerk had the drawer open, his fingers hovering above the packets. "Close it," I said gently, and put my card upon the wood. It bore a name the bank officers had learned to respect in connection with a certain thin gentleman of Baker Street. The clerk's eyes widened. The drawer slid shut with a little thud. The messenger's head jerked toward the doors. He gathered himself as a terrier does before a bolt. He never made it. Lestrade, who had been reading the shipping news with a diligence that would have deceived his own superior, materialized at the man's elbow with 2 plainclothes men in his wake. "Gently," the inspector murmured, and one revolver muzzle pressed the messenger's ribs while the other relieved him of the envelope. "We shall inquire of Mr. Acton in person whether he cares to fetch his property by such hands." The fellow fought, nevertheless, savagely, silently, with a wrenching strength not unlike Vogel's own, though less practiced. His cap fell. The 2 heavy mourning bands slid to the floor. Beneath the glove, when it tore, the fingers showed that yellow stain to the knuckles which Holmes had promised, the regalia of Clerkenwell ground into the grain. There is a point at which obstinacy becomes futility. He found it at last, panting, the steel bracelets meeting under his wrists. "You'll hang the wrong man," he spat, and named, under his breath, a person we had not yet met. "Mr. Rath." "Rath," said Lestrade, as if scratching a note in his mind. He signaled, and the prisoner was conducted out by a side door to spare the lobby a scene. We had barely regained our seats when a small commotion arose on the pavement across the way. A shabby porter had been loitering there since 11. He now came down from his post and limped into the very doorway of Capel and Company. The limp, I need hardly say, vanished as a man in a well-cut frock-coat came out to accost him. The frock-coat's wearer was English to the eye that reads cut and shirt front, but there was a certain set about the mouth, an economy of movement, that speaks of the counting-house at Hamburg or Bremen. He took the porter's arm familiarly and, with the speed of one who has rehearsed the whole, pressed upon him a folded paper and an envelope exactly like that which had been offered at the bank. The porter, Our porter looked down, frowned, said something that made the other start, and, with an unshabby motion astonishing in one of his apparent class, clapped a hand upon the frock-coated man's wrist. The frock-coat twisted, glanced for the open street, and met a cane laid neatly across his path. The cane belonged to no less a person than the shabby porter himself, who at that instant shed his rags and manner as a snake sheds its skin. Holmes's back straightened, the battered cap came off, and the face I knew so well shone for a second with the cold light of satisfaction. The man in the frock-coat, Mr. Wrath, it needed no clairvoyance to believe, hesitated a fraction too long. Two constables, whose attention had coincidentally fixed upon a far chimney just then, discovered reasons to lay hands upon his elbows. The group disappeared into Keppel's doorway like a tableau swallowed by a curtain. I could not see what passed within. I had to content myself with my own little battleground, for no sooner had the bank resumed a semblance of order than a junior clerk of my acquaintance from Red Lion Court, young Dodd, appeared at my elbow, pale to the lips. "Dr. Watson, Mr. Holmes, if you please. The office, Mr. Acton bids you come at once." "Why? Speak plainly, my lad," he gulped. "It's Mr. Pierce, sir. He has done a dreadful thing. He tried to burn the Burnham box. He would have had it, but the lid was chained to the press. He said he was sent, oh Lord have mercy, by Mr. Wrath of Mincing Lane, and now he's fled by the back stair." We were in a cab before the words had left his mouth. Lestrade, catching the tail of our flight, sprang to the step and swung in with the agility of a man to whom cabs are a second home. "Wrath," he snapped. "So that is our English face to a German house, and Pierce the inside man. The last piece fits. At Red Lion Court we found disorder, and Mr. Acton rigid with a fury so cold that for the first time I conceived him capable of dangerous action. He pointed without speech to the press. The lid of the Burnham box was scorched. A patch of carpet bore the black kisses of a lamp set down too long. He begged, Acton said at last, each word precise, for a week, then for 2, always at his books, always first at his stool and last to leave. I trusted that diligence. He had debts. He told me as much, and I advanced him a clerk's loan. This morning he was his usual meek self. At 11 he asked leave to carry a draft to Chancery Lane. He returned by the rear stair. When I came from court at half, I smelt the smoke. He had run. Dodd saw his back. He cried he was a fool, and had been promised 50 sovereigns by Mr. Wrath. Holmes said from the threshold, where he stood with the serenity of a man who has just concluded a satisfactory interview. He was dusting his sleeve with a fastidious forefinger. "We have him, Inspector." The counting-house has been relieved of a manager, and a drawer relieved of letters sufficient to shadow more than one reputation. Capel himself is innocent in the active sense. He has kept his hands for the ledger and left the alley to Wrath, but his books will not read as sweetly to thee customs as they did at breakfast. As for Pierce, he will not go far. He has no head for flight. He left his overcoat, and more damning, his mother's address upon the back of a bill. He will go to her. When a rat finds fire where its nest was, it runs home. He crossed to the scorched lid and laid his palm an inch above it as a chef tests a pan. Still warm. He set his lamp here to free both hands. Note, Watson, the smear along the rim, brown, brittle, shellac. He meant to gum the lock when he had filched the contents, and to leave us a pleasant puzzle. A closed press, an open box, and no man to own the one or the other. He has learned well from his betters. "Vogel?" Lestrade asked. Holmes inclined his head. "Vogel taught the darker arts. Wrath paid for the lesson and supplied the rest. The forged authorization that smelt of a chemist's drawer, the messenger with the mourning band to soften a clerk's heart, the inside hand to open the right lid at the right minute. All neat, all almost sufficient." He glanced at me, a flicker of humor there. Almost, my dear Watson, is a word that keeps respectable men from ruin and rogues from success. A scuffle on the stair concluded the matter for the moment. A constable's voice, half apology, half triumph, preceded the entrance of Pierce himself, white and shaking, his hair in damp points upon his brow. He looked from Acton to the scorched box, and covered his face with his ink-blotched hands. He said no harm would be done. He sobbed into his palms. Only a paper no one would miss, only a bond no Englishman cared for, only a trick to keep a widow quiet, he said. The gentleman at Mincing Lane would see me right. Holmes's voice, when it came, was not unkind. There is this to be said for you, Pierce. You have spared us the tedium of drawing your confession out yard by yard. You will give Inspector Lestrade the hour you opened the rear stair and the nights you admitted Vogel. You will name the tavern where wrath pressed the 50 sovereigns into your hand, and you will sit where honest men sit when they have let fear make them fools. If you keep nothing back, the judge may think the better of you. Pierce nodded, gulping, and allowed the handcuffs without struggle. Lestrade, all briskness again, marshalled his men and the prisoner with practiced economy. Acton made a small, stiff bow to Holmes. "Sir," he said, his voice lower, "you have saved my house from a scandal that would have bled us of clients for a generation. I am in your debt." Holmes waved the courtesy aside as one flicks ash from a sleeve. "You are in the debt of a lady who bears more than her share with admirable composure. When she holds what is lawfully hers, I shall consider my account squared. Until then," his eyes hardened, "there remains a throat in Newgate and a ledger in Mincing Lane. The first will talk to save its skin. The second will talk because it is built to keep the truth in even rows. Between them we shall learn for whose purse you're mister." Rath lifted his hand. And so, with the scorched smell of near ruin still in our nostrils and the fog pressing its cold face against the glass, we stood at last with the shape of the conspiracy plain. A foreign house that lent its name, an English hand that managed its daring, a shadow worker who did the silent part, and a frightened boy who opened a door. The end was close, and I confess my heart quickened, for I knew that when Holmes spoke of ledgers, he was already hearing the rustle of pages that would tell him, line by careful line, exactly where the money went, and who waited for it. Lestrade lost no time in separating his birds. Vogel went to a cell of the yard's inner corridor with a warder who had the patience of a stone. Rath was held in a private room and left to contemplate a charge sheet laid out before him like a bill of fare. Pierce, the wretched clerk, sat between two policemen with his face in his hands and his breath hitching like a child's. Holmes, who had the aspect of a man setting a set of chessmen upon the board he finally wanted, gave 3 instructions in quick succession: that Vogel and Rath were to be kept from all communication, that Pierce should have pen, paper, and the promise that truth might yet weigh with an English judge, and that a messenger be sent at once to secure a magistrate's authority for the examination of Capel and Company's books. By 4 o'clock we were in Mincing Lane with Lestrade's warrant and a clerk from the court whose spectacles gave the whole proceeding that air of solemn legality, beloved of the British conscience. Mr. Capel himself received us with a courteous stiffness that would have done no discredit to a privy councillor. He was a spare man with a grey beard divided exactly at the chin and a habit of folding his hands whenever an awkward subject approached, as if to show that they were empty. Holmes saluted him with a bow which an enemy might have found dangerously respectful. "We are obliged to you for your time, Mr. Capel. We inquire into a murder in Red Lion Court and into an attempt upon the property of a lady of Fitzroy Square. We have reason to believe that your late manager, one Mr. Rath, has served other masters than yourself, and has drawn upon your house's instruments to do so. Capel inclined his head by the thickness of a sheet of vellum. It grieves me to hear it. If Mr. Rath has, what is the English idiom, played a double game, he has done so to his own undoing. Pray, examine what you will. Our books are franker than our speech. He rang. A porter, not the one whose pipe had dressed a sail, brought ledger after ledger to the counting desk. Holmes did not pause. He never does when a quicker appetite would spoil his meal. He leafed rather languidly, murmuring a date here, a sum there, until he came to a volume whose back had been mended with newer calf than its fellows, and upon which the gilt letterer had misspaced a word. Commission S. He drew it nearer, turned 3 leaves, and laid one long forefinger upon a column of entries headed Sundry Foreign. The sums were not large singly. Together they footed to a respectable figure. Opposite certain of them there recurred at irregular intervals 3 marks in violet pencil, a tiny capital R, a stroke like a figure 1, and, more rarely, 2 cramped initials, A, V. Holmes glanced at Lestrade. You observe our friends have left their visiting cards. Rath took his wages as neatly as any clerk tells himself he will repay an advance. Vogel took a bounty whenever the shadow work was finer than usual. Now, Mr. Capel, I beg your pardon for an inelegant request. He lifted the blotting book that lay upon the desk. Your blotting book. Capel produced it without turning a hair. Holmes drew off the top sheet, took a soft pencil from his pocket, and with a few swift sideways strokes coaxed from the impressed fibers the ghost of what had been last written there. It rose as if a tide had brought it. Burnham inst. Rath to arrange. Conf. Vogel by rear. Pierce 2. The tail of the word was wrecked by a drop of something that had fallen upon the page and dried, a faint brown ring with a resinous scent. Holmes's eyes smiled before his lips did. Thank you, he said simply, and laid the book aside as if it had told him nothing of consequence. Capel's hands folded themselves. If you will prefer a charge, Inspector, you will do it at once. I have no interest in shielding a servant who has disgraced my firm. You will find that our consignments and our credits stand square. We have in no way trespassed upon English law. English law, said Holmes very gently, is concerned with the manner as well as the matter. When a gentleman sets his subordinate to create phantoms in order to steal a widow's due, it takes no comfort that the books stand square. I will not detain you longer. The yard will require Mr. Rath's room sealed, his keys. Thank you, and such private correspondence as you think may help him to remember the names he will presently be asked to recite. Outside in the lane, the light had thinned to a putty wash. Holmes tucked the violet-marked ledger under his arm as one tucks a newspaper, and led us, without explanation, to a narrow court behind a coffee-house that smelt of chicory and wet wool. There he read in silence, running like a ferret along the lines, his finger counting, adding, jumping, until at last he closed the book and rapped its back with his knuckles. There is a name here that never appears and yet is everywhere, he said. Consider, Rath receives small sums repeatedly for advices, all timed to dates upon which certain contracts in the Levant Railway Syndicate were to be moved from one bank to another. Vogel is paid thrice, once the day before poor Gower's death. Pierce receives nothing in the books because he is paid in sovereigns over a tavern table. And over all these runs a stream of credits from a house in Hamburg that does no business in England unless one counts a gentleman who signs his letters as A. Renslow when he writes here, and Rensler when he writes home. Lestrade whistled between his teeth. An alias across the water. A convenience, Holmes said. Our Mr. Rath has English cut and German thrift. He will have taken his chief's English name as a courtesy when speaking to Englishmen. Renslow, Rensler, Rath. He flicked the ledger with a nail. We shall not waste the morning hunting Teutonic shades. We will pull the one rope that runs through every pulley. He looked up at me, the old light in his face. The bond, Watson. I patted my breast, for he had made me Ewood's guardian while he flitted in and out of disguises here. Good. It has drawn every creature in this little menagerie. It will draw one more. This evening there will be a transfer at the bank, as announced. There will also be, at 8, a private delivery at a safe address. So private that only a frightened manager, a desperate shadow worker, and their paymaster could claim to know it. He took from his pocket the slip torn from the shipping circular, the one that named Thursday 4. At 4, our friend meant to take ship or to hand the instrument to one who would. We will oblige him with an alternative that is nearer and more urgent. He wrote 3 notes in a hand that would have deceived a man's mother, much less his employer. One was addressed to the bank, confirming the noon presentation, one to Mrs. Burnham, bidding her remain in Bayswater and fear nothing, and the third to the porter at Capel's from Mr. Rath, commending him to open the back door at 10 minutes before 8 to admit a foreign gentleman who will take a sealed packet on Mr. Renslow's order. He sealed this last and sent it by a boy whose capacity for not understanding what he carried would have made him a minister of the crown. At Baker Street, as the lamps were being lit, he laid the bond upon the table and regarded it with the peculiar tenderness he gives to the most impersonal of objects when they are the key to a human knot. It has been annotated by a hand that thinks in tailors, he said. Yet the paper is English, the justice is English, and the lady is English. There is pleasure in restoring such a thing to its right. Will they come, Holmes? I asked. They have come at every note we have played, he returned. They will not miss the finale. We dined early and without appetite. At 7, Lestrade joined us, grave and eager, with 2 plainclothes men who could pass for dockhands, and a sergeant whose boots creaked when he was nervous. Holmes parcelled us as neatly as if he were dividing loaves. Lestrade and the sergeant to the alley behind Capel's, one man to trail any messenger who left by the front, I to the counting room itself, behind a screen where I might see without being seen. Holmes? He smiled that sliver of a smile. Everywhere else. The counting-house at that hour had the deserted hush of a church between services. A single lamp burned under a green shade upon the cashier's desk. The smell of varnish seemed thicker in the quiet. I took my post behind the screen, feeling my heart strike my ribs with an insistence that clarified rather than shook my senses. The minutes slipped by with the exaggerated pace of suspense. Somewhere in the lane, a coster cried his wares. Somewhere nearer, a hinge complained and was hushed. At 10 minutes to 8, the back latch gave the smallest click. A shape slid in, no more than a darker piece of the dark, and moved with the confidence of one who had counted the paces. He wore no hat. His hair, carefully brushed, showed iron gray. He crossed to the cashier's desk, took from his pocket a key that turned too easily in a lock that had too often felt it, and from the open till drew out a packet as like the bond as one egg is like another. He did not start when a man's voice spoke softly from the crooked shadow of the doorway. You have saved us all a journey to the docks, Mr. Renslow, said Holmes. It is considerate of you to carry your Hamburg with you when you come to London. Shall we exchange papers? The one you hold is of my manufacture and will not pass a German eye. The man did not drop the packet. He stood very still. You overrate your position, Mr. Holmes, he replied in excellent English that had learned its consonants in Holstein. You have 2 villains and a frightened boy. You do not have me. I have your sums, Holmes returned, with a mildness more fatal than any blow. And presently I shall have your signature. Do not make the last part rude. Inspector, if you please. The green shade snuffed outward as if a breath had put it out. In the instant of velvet dark, a door opened sharply in the alley, and the creak of the sergeant's boots came like the sound of verdict. A hand touched my sleeve. I stepped from behind the screen with my revolver leveled, and as the lamp flared again, trimmed by a match that seemed to appear of itself at Holmes's fingers, the man we had hunted stood in that uncompromising light with the calm of a banker whose only crime is to have believed his arithmetic moral. He looked from the pistol to the packet, weighed for a heartbeat the odds upon flight, and set the false bond down upon the desk with a contemptuous precision that admitted defeat by admitting nothing at all. "Very well," he said. "If one must be robbed, it is something to be robbed by an artist." Lestrade stepped in with the quiet efficiency of a man who has closed many such circles. The sergeant took our gentleman lightly by the elbow. The plainclothes men relieved him of a flat leather case which, when opened, proved to contain a second envelope, blank but of the right make and size, and a stick of sealing wax scored by recent use. Renslow, shall we call him so, watched the proceedings with the detached attention of a chess player who has misread a forced line 5 moves back and now studies the end merely to improve his memory. He did not resist. He did not confess. He permitted himself the smallest of smiles when his eye fell upon the false bond Holmes had set upon the desk. "You have your theatre, Mr. Holmes," he said. "I have always thought Englishmen would rather act a little than do a great deal. Shall we go where you prefer to deliver your speech?" "Presently," Holmes returned. "My remarks are brief and require no applause." He took up the packet I had guarded, and with a nicety that I have seen him apply to the most trivial evidence, where it touched honor, slipped it once again into the inner pocket of his coat. "Inspector, we shall want Mr. Renslow and his late manager lodged apart, and a clerk to sit up with each. Vogel is to be told, as from the turnkey, that the bond was recovered at noon and is to be transferred tomorrow. Mr. Renslow is to be told nothing at all. He thrives on the news he purchases." In the yard outside the counting-house, the fog had lifted to a dim, sourceless glow. We took cabs in silence, Holmes and I with Lestrade, and our prisoner, who held himself as stiff as a torse form, with the sergeant and the others following with the seized papers. At the yard, the formalities consumed fewer minutes than a man might expend tasting a cigar. Lestrade, to his credit, had learned that speed is often the mother of truth. By the time I had got the damp from my coat at the charge-room fire, both Rath and Renslow had been shown to separate rooms, and Vogel, glowering under his scar, had been conducted past us with a warder at either elbow. Holmes desired a table, paper, and the blotting book we had taken from Mincing Lane. He set the ledger beside them, and with 2 fingers drew down the gas until the flame made a steady blue tongue. "There are 2 ways to end a game, Watson," he observed, half to me, half to the room. "One may sweep the pieces off in temper, or one may show the losing side that the board has only 1 legal move left. I prefer the latter." He made 3 columns upon the paper and headed them with neat initials, A, V, and P. Under each he wrote dates and sums, a penciled arrow here to a Hamburg credit, there to a sundry foreign. Then, with a curious gentleness, he raised the blotter again and shaded the last page until the ghost-writing bloomed once more. "Burnham inst, Rath to arrange, conf. Vogel by rear, Pierce 2, he rang. "Mr. Rath first," he said when Lestrade looked in. The manager came between 2 men with the air of one who has rehearsed an injured dignity and finds the stage unfriendly. Holmes did not offer him a chair. He tapped the paper with his forefinger. "This is the year's arithmetic, Mr. Rath. It is excellent. I commend the regularity of your advices. Unfortunately for you, it is too regular. We have the entries, Mr. Renslow cared to show the world, and the ones he could not avoid showing his own house. We have, by the kindness of your blotting book, the private rubric by which you turn the law into a parlor trick. And we have, in the scrawl of a frightened boy, the hour at which you paid 50 sovereigns to betray his master's key. You will presently observe that Mr. Renslow's column of sums is very short, his health excellent, and his appetite for sacrifice large. If you continue to serve him, you will serve him from the drop. If you prefer your own account to run a little longer, you will write here. He slid a blank before him. The names of the 2 taverns where you met Vogel, the dates upon which you drew the string through Mr. Gower's closet bolt, and the manner in which you obtained the impression of Mr. Acton's key. Rath's lips moved twice before sound came. You have nothing of mine, he managed, and set his jaw. Holmes glanced once at Lestrade, whose cane made a faint, impatient tap upon the floor. On the contrary, said Holmes, I have your handwriting. He turned the blotter to a fresh sheet, shaded and lifted. A bold, angular air sprang up with the impatience of a man accustomed to initialing others' labor. Rath's eyes followed the movement despite himself. That one involuntary glance was, in Holmes's economy, worth a paragraph of oath. The man's shoulders sagged. He will never speak, he said with a kind of sullen admiration, jerking his head toward the door that held Renslow. He will drink port, and he will sleep. You will never touch him. Poor arithmetic, Holmes murmured. We touch men seldom by hand. He inclined his head. The taverns. Rath named them. He added, with a dog's flick at its own sore, that the impression had been made months before by Pierce upon a dab of warmed sealing wax, under color of cleaning the wards. He said nothing of the murder until Holmes's pen, moving of itself, wrote Gower, strangled caught, and paused. Then the words came out of him unwillingly, each its own defeat. Vogel took his wire. I was not there. I arranged the rear stair, no more. He said it would be neat. He swore the old man would drop without a struggle. We waited in the alley for the sign. There was none. He came down, smiling. That is all. It is enough, said Holmes. You will sign your recital. If you alter it tomorrow, a jury will prefer the first. Send him out, Inspector, and bring me Mr. Renslow. If Rath had been the English face of the thing, Renslow was its appetite. He took his chair as a man takes a pew, politely, without interest. Holmes offered him the same paper with its 3 columns, the same ledger, the same flow of figures set out like a proof with no steps omitted. Renslow attended as a schoolmaster attends a dull boy's recitation. When Holmes finished, he stroked his little finger along the blotting paper to remove an imaginary crumb and smiled. Charming, he said. You have the thread, Mr. Holmes, and the moth, but the cloth remains. You cannot persuade 12 Englishmen to hang a foreign merchant for zeal. They will say the world is business. They will say the widow will be paid. They will say Mr. Gower was old. Holmes's eyes were very bright and very cold. The cloth, he returned, has a flaw which even a city jury will see. It runs here. He touched the ghosted words with the pencil. Vogel by rear. Your instruction, your hand, your instrument. He went by the rear because you paid him to go so, and he took his wire because you required a silence that papers cannot buy. The rest is housekeeping. There is, however, one trifle you have overlooked that will weigh even with the dullest 12. Renslow lifted his brows. Indeed, the shadow that passed through the door, Holmes said, as if it amused him to pronounce the title of our case in the man's presence. It will delight them. They will speak of it to their wives. They will remember that you bought ground glass, shellac, camphor, and a small lantern at your manager's order, paid from your petty cash, 3 days before a clerk, saw a man's shadow in a room whose occupant lay already dead upon the carpet. They will enjoy the neatness of it. They will be grateful for an English entertainment with a foreign villain. You will have given them a story. Juries are very human, Mr. Renslow. For the first time, something stirred behind that composed mask, not fear precisely, but calculation denied an avenue. He sat forward the breadth of a nail. "What do you propose?" "Nothing theatrical," said Holmes. "Merely that you write in your own hand that you commissioned Wrath to recover a certain instrument by any means not overtly violent, that Wrath employed Vogel, that you were aware of the existence of an inner stair, and that you promised sums additional upon success. In return, you will receive a charge more comfortable to your conscience than murder, and a crown counsel who will not press for the rope. Refuse, and I shall show the bank your ghost writing and the Hamburg house your English name. I imagine both will be wounding." There was a long, very quiet moment in which the tick of the corridor clock was audible as a drip in a cave. Then Renslow took up the pen. He did not ask for terms again. He wrote with care, as men of his sort do when they inscribe their will. When he had finished, he sanded the sheet, blew lightly, and set it aside with a little motion of distaste, as if the page smelt of commerce done badly. Holmes Reed nodded once and folded it. "Thank you," he said, with a civility that was not without pity. "Inspector, you have your 3 strands. Twist them together, and you have a rope strong enough for any court." He rose, stretched as if shaking from his limbs, a stiffness contracted in watching shadows, and turned to me with that relaxation of feature which tells me the chase, for him, is already memory. "We will go to Fitzroy Square, Watson. A lady has sat patient under orders, and there is a paper in my pocket that will mend a winter for her. It is a very small thing, but one must, from time to time, remember why one troubles to be exact." We took our cloaks. In the passage, Lestrade came after us, his face alight with that rarest of his expressions, earnest gratitude. "Holmes," he said, "you've untied a knot the yard would have cut and made a tangle of. I shall say so where it will be heard. Mind you, I shall keep the shadow through the door for my own dinner table." "Do," said Holmes, amused, "but be precise in your parallax, or you will be corrected by a boy with a slide lantern. Come, Watson, there is yet a demonstration to be made tonight in Red Lion Court. When we have finished it, even the charwoman will know where the ghost stood and why the key would not turn." The fog had thinned by the time we reached Fitzroy Square, where Mrs. Burnham awaited us in a drawing-room lit by a single shaded lamp. She rose quickly at our entrance, her veil cast back, her face pale but composed. Holmes drew from his coat the bond, its seal unbroken, and placed it gently upon the table before her. "Madame," he said with a bow of unusual grace, "this is yours by right, safeguarded against those who would have perverted it to their own ends. You may present it to the bank without fear. The law stands with you, and so, if I may say, does justice." Her composure faltered, her lips trembling as she murmured her thanks. I saw in that instant how much of her strength had been spent in silence and patience. Holmes, who notices everything but admits little, looked away as though embarrassed by gratitude. When we had left her reassured, he proposed a final errand. At Red Lion Court, before a small gathering of clerks and constables, he reconstructed the deception. He set a lamp by the desk, dimmed the burner, and showed how a man outside could cast his shadow across the ground glass, while within another man might lie dead upon the carpet. The clerks, wide-eyed, nodded as the illusion appeared before them. Dodd the junior nearly gasped aloud when his own silhouette seemed to pass through the closed door. "There, gentlemen," Holmes concluded, "is your ghost, not the work of spirits, but of parallax and resin. aided by the eagerness of the human mind to see what it expects. A deception worthy of a showman, yet behind it only greed. Lestrade clapped his hands together briskly, as if to clear the air of phantoms. Well, Mr. Holmes, I dare say the jury will take kindly to a tale with shadows and foreign rogues. The law will do its part. London is safe of them now. Later, back at Baker Street, I could not resist a final word. You have exposed a plot of international cunning, Holmes, and restored a widow's security. Surely even you must feel satisfaction. He smiled faintly, his long fingers steepled. Satisfaction, Watson, is a dangerous indulgence. There will always be another shadow, another trick contrived by human avarice. Today it was a lantern slide and a clerk's betrayal. Tomorrow, who can say? My work is not to exalt, but to observe, to deduce, and to prevent. I pressed him no further. The fire burned low. The city outside hushed, and Holmes leaned back into the quiet with that air of infinite patience which suggested he was already listening for the faint stirrings of the next mystery. As for me, I closed my notebook upon the case of the shadow that passed through the door, knowing that long after the courts had spoken, it would remain in my memory as one of Holmes's strangest victories, where science, unmasked superstition, and the merest shadow led us to the truth.